All right. Actually, I did want to say something about this, just because I thought that what we heard in the last talk about transferable utility and non-transferable utility and an intermediate case, I thought was kind of interesting. There really are basically only two things. There's transferable utility and non-transferable utility, and the difference is the following. In non-transferable utility games, you describe the set of things that are available to an to different individuals, right, by, well, actually what we have, let me start again. We'll describe something that we call a utility allocation, right? And that is just a vector of utilities, one for you, one for me, so on and so forth. When utility is not transferable, if we have a coalition and we want to know what that utility, what that coalition can achieve, we have to describe the whole set, okay? And so we have so when we want to assign some kind of value to a coalition, we say it's this set of utilities. When we have transferable utility, we just add them up and we say that the value was set as a number. Why can we do that? Well, what we're looking for is an allocation of utilities that satisfies certain constraints. So, for example, in the core, right, which is something that you might have studied in graduate microtheory, the idea is that an allocation is in the core if there's no coalition that can break off and on its own do just as well and better for somebody. So, for instance, if we have a particular allocation where I get 1 and you get 2 and Steven gets 10, but maybe you and I can go off on our own and get 5 each, and so that allocation isn't going to be in the core because he's getting too much, as is usually the case. Okay, and so what we're doing is we're kind of testing for all these different constraints. Now why is it the case that if we have a more refined solution concept like the bargaining set, why is it that you and I could break off? Because we have to look at, is there a coalition in there that we could get? And the constraint at that level would be individual rationality. You're going to get 5, I'm going to get 5. And furthermore, no one of us, if we break off, could get 6. Okay, that's the coalition of 1, right? So we have all these different inequalities. If we have transferable utilities, we can just summarize all those inequalities by numbers, because those inequalities that we have to work at the individual level, we can just add them up when we have transferable utility. Okay, and so the 3 cases that Professor Chipori was referring to was what he called non-transferable utility, said that if we wanted to graph, suppose we only have 2 people and we want to graph what a characteristic function looks like, we want to say what is the set of feasible utilities for the coalition of 2. His version of that was that it's a box. Okay, that you're going to get this, I'm going to get this, and maybe you could throw away something, or maybe I could throw away something, right? More generally in non-transferable utility games, okay, you could have a set that is not a hyperplane with slope -1 like he was talking about, but it could be something that looks like this and then everything down below it, right? And then in the transferable utility case, that set of utility bundles is in fact everything honorable. It's a half space that's defined by a hyperplane with slope -1. And so when you go back and look at the literature, okay, if you're going to look, say, in the game theory literature, in the cooperative game theory literature for this kind of intermediate case, you won't really find it because it is subsumed under what Shapley and others do with non-transferable utility. That's not to say that it's not that the distinction he makes is not important. It really is very important, and you could actually see it in much of what he talked about. But I just wanted to get straight this terminology, because if you go to look it up and you go into, say, the International Journal of Game Theory, you're going to be looking for a long time. All right, so that's just a note on terminology. And now I will begin talking about what I'm really supposed to talk about, which is social networks. And more generally, I want to talk a little bit about social interaction models. Now, I think that well, let me just actually put up 2 quotations. There are kind of 2 views, in 2 extreme views in the social sciences about how economic life actually works. So many sociologists see economic life as being deeply embedded in larger social life. And Polanyi, how many of you know who Karl Polanyi is, right? A few of you do. The rest of you become well-read. Yeah, this is where it is, okay. I don't know which one, I've got so many I can point at. This is, Karl Polanyi, writing a long time ago, said that takes this kind of extreme view, right? That economics actually disappears within this larger social structure. On the other hand, there's been, among economists, we have a tradition of paying relatively little, until recently at least, of paying relatively little attention to social structure and focusing on individual choice. So a sociologist might say that, my fake made-up sociologist, because I think today most sociologists don't really say this, but a sociologist would say that economic activity is deeply constrained by social norms, by social conventions, by social relationships that we are involved in. And economists, of course, as you know, in the neoclassical paradigm, we just start out with individual maximization, and we don't worry about any of these constraints, and we run from there. Now, in fact, this division has never really been clear-cut. This bottom thing here is a well-known quotation. Economics is all about how people make choices. Sociology is all about why they don't have any choices to make. This was said by Jim Duesenberry at a conference many years ago, I guess in 1960 or 1959, and people read this comment to say that, since it was made by an economist, right, that economics is right in some sense. We should not worry about this property of embeddedness, right, of economic life in social structure. But in fact, that's actually not what Duesenberry was saying, right? Duesenberry was actually commenting on a paper by Gary Becker. He went on to say, he was talking about it was actually Becker's, a paper Becker's on the family. And Duesenberry actually went on to say that there is no one in this room, not even Becker, who considers himself free to choose either 2 children who go to university or 4 children who stop their education after high school. Okay, so he too was acknowledging that economic life is in fact embedded in larger social structure. Now, there's a big debate that goes on as to how much that actually, to what degree should we account for it. And you'll find, and I think this is interesting, you'll find economists and sociologists on both sides of the debate. It's not that the econ guys are over here and the sociology guys are over there. No, they're actually intermingled. So Mark Granovetter, for instance, a well-known sociologist, has a critique of the sociological analysis of economic life, of this modern kind of socioeconomics, where he points out that many sociologists have gone kind of overboard on this notion of embeddedness, right? And certainly there are. He's not alone in that critique. And on the other hand, you can find many economists who, well, not many economists, you can certainly find groups of economists who say that we ignore this way too much. And so there's this interesting mix in the middle. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. Now, so what I'm interested in is that that normally when we think about economy, well, if you think about what you've been studying, right, for the last couple of years, you've been studying markets, right? But there's lots of ways in which there are a lot of other allocation processes other than markets, right, which are used to to distribute goods and services. We can talk about, for example, political mechanisms, right? And of course, we also have all kinds of social exchange, right? Which are ways of transaction. And so what we discover when we start unpacking, we start thinking in a very general sense about things like social norms and social pressure and stuff like this. We uncover different ways in which other individuals' actions impinge upon our own. And back in the, back when I was in graduate school, back in the 70s, you just said, well, these are all externalities and we're not going to worry about them, okay? And now we actually model these externalities very carefully, and this is the source of the literature on social interactions, which Steven has contributed so much to, and many others as well. And so what these models are, these social interaction models are, what they do is they're an attempt to capture some of these other social forces and understand how they work on their own or how they interact with markets in order to affect allocative processes. Now, I've just listed here, just off the top of my head, this, here's 4 or 5. I could easily double the length of this list of phenomena that had been studied using social interaction models. And by the way, these are typically models that, well, most of the work is empirical without a great deal of theory. But if you really thought about what the theory would be, it would probably be something game theoretic. It doesn't seem to be too far away. And I'm going to talk a lot about that later on. There are a number of different mechanisms that people have talked about, which are ways in which social influence is exerted in a society. So we talk about peer effects, for instance, right? And peer pressure. So we all, it was said actually in the 1980s and 1990s that labor economists were having a hard time actually finding peer effects on educational outcomes in the data. And yet at the same time, labor economists were paying outrageous sums of money for houses in neighborhoods where the kids were good, right? So that the kids could go to a good school, right? And it wasn't for the teachers, it was for the peer group, right? So the problem wasn't with the data, the problem's with the models, right? So peer effects have been studied. Role models are another way in which a social interaction appears. Social norms, more generally, we don't really. Social norms are one of these great phrases. No one knows exactly what it means, right? I think there's kind of a pornographic definition of social norms, and by a pornographic definition, I mean by analogy with the famous Stephen. Which justice was it who defined? Thank you, right? That I know it when I see it, right? And that's the pornographic definition. Social learning, right? So how many of you are interested in development economics? Right? A few of you are, right? So you might find yourself doing village studies, right, to understand things like how it is that new technologies get adopted, right? And there have been many good papers that have been written on these kinds of things. And important models of those today. I'm thinking, for example, about the work by Chris Udry and Tim Conley on pineapples in Ghana. You guys know this stuff, right? So this is a social learning kind of story. We're going to talk about learning in a network. Social capital, another great phrase. Stephen has written a wonderful critique of the phrase. But this is a word. It's interesting. I think you hear this word less today, this phrase less today than you heard it, say 5 years ago. But it's certainly tossed around a lot, and certainly a lot of people fight to take credit for the phrase. Again, everything that falls under this rubric of social capital, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about social capital later. Again, these are the subject of social interaction modeling. All right. So, what kind of research methodologies can we deploy? So if you are interested in social interactions and if you are interested in peer effects and things like this, the very first temptation, of course, if you're a theorist as I am, is to jump to game theoretic models, network models, so on and so forth. You can channel Matt Jackson if that's what you want to do, right? And if you're an empirical person, immediately you're trying to, think about the ad health data set, right? Because that seems to be where all the work goes on, right? And all that. So I want to encourage you before you do that, is to actually get some experiential knowledge. Now, I don't suggest that you go and hang out on street corners yourselves, but there are wonderful ethnographies. I think it's worthwhile if you're interested in urban poverty, for example, to read some of these. My favorite on this list, by the way, is this voting study, which was done in 1948. Paul Lazarsfeld, who's actually kind of a hero of mine, went and actually spent 9 months in Elmira, New York, which is very difficult research, I think, to go spend 9 months in Elmira, New York, and studied voting behavior, right? And found all kinds of interesting facts that have since fueled a whole industry. So many these are just kind of classic ethnographies, and I want to encourage you, if you're interested in this stuff, to actually go read the ethnographic literature and get some deeper context about what it is. It's amazing to me when I listen to job talks and then I ask some questions and I find out that, that here we are, people talking about, peer group effects who actually don't know anything about what goes on in a classroom, right? And I think that's a little strange. And so here's a list of some of my favorites, just to mention them. Okay. Getting to stuff that we might actually do. I'm a great believer in comparative advantage. We don't have comparative advantage in participant observer research methodologies, right? What we do is we go to data sets. And we're not at data sets yet. So social psychologists, of course, have done some very interesting kinds of experiments that have demonstrated the importance of different kinds of social influences. How many of you have heard of the Robbers Cave experiment? Do you know this? So basically what this guy, Sharif, and a bunch of colleagues did was there's a state park in Oklahoma called Robbers Cave State Park. They took a bunch of boys up there and they divided, and the boys were all friendly and they hung out and all that. We're having a great time at summer camp. And then they divided them into groups, okay? 2 groups, right? And then they kind of started talking, the people who were with Group A started dissing Group B, right? And they had some competitions organized between Group A and Group B. And pretty soon they had these guys, they had them actually at the point where they had to be separated, right? And one group went in and like tore up the other guy's beds, and then the other group, it was really, one of the versions of this that they ran, they actually had to stop the experiment, right? Because it was getting, and then, but in the manipulation that they actually published, it's unfortunately, this seems to be typical of a lot of social psychology work. We've heard about all kinds of scandals in this area today involving social psychology research. Same thing, they actually did something like 5 or 6 of these things. They only reported on one of them, okay? In the book that we all know. And in that one, the boys started fighting each other and they were separated and they had wars and all this kind of stuff. And then they were brought back together. The researchers manufactured an emergency. We ran out of water. We have to start trucking water from someplace. You guys are going to have to carry water. And then all these kids, I think it was water, I'm not sure, something like this, right? And then everyone had to work together, and in relatively short time, the animosity disappeared. The conformity experiments, how many of you have heard, maybe I'll describe the experiment, tell me if you've heard it. We draw some lines on the board of different lengths, right? We bring some people into the room, one of whom is a graduate student, right? People are asked to say which is the longest line, right? And the graduate student points to like the middle length line, says, oh, that's the longest line, right? And obviously and then how many people actually say that that's the longest line? A significant number of them do, right? Conformity affects peer pressure. 6 degrees of separation. This is a lesson in how not to do social science research. There's been many, many criticisms of this. The phrase 6 degrees of separation is not Milgram's phrase. It actually goes to Timothy Guare, is that the guy who wrote the play, 6 Degrees of Separation, right? Which my introduction to social interaction research was that I saw that play in its original run in New York, and I got interested in that. In any event, many people have criticized this. You know the story that there were some people in was it Omaha or Kansas City, somewhere in the Midwest, right? And they were handed letters and asked to deliver them, send them to someone they knew, and somehow get them to a designated person who was either in Newton, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island. I don't remember which. Okay, and some of the letters got there reasonably quickly, I think, is a summary of what the data said. Someone wrote an article, for example, criticizing this which said if Obama is only, not Obama, he said, if Osama is only 6 degrees away, why can't we find him? right? And this was an article that appeared in a psychology journal. And someone has actually gone back and looked at the research notes that he took, and you can find critiques of this. But nonetheless, this is a very powerful idea, and people. Surprisingly, there's been relatively few attempts to actually replicate this experiment, and the attempts that there have been work very differently. So, for example, there have been some attempts to do this by email through university communities. It's not surprising that the degree of separation there should be quite small, right? And so this is what one finds. On the other hand, when you put layers of social class in between, in the few attempts that have been done with that, basically nothing goes through. Right? All right. Getting to things which economists might do, there have been a number of so-called natural experiments, right, that economists have leaped on for the data opportunities they provide. Two of these are that have been studied in great detail by a number of different people. And I just mentioned two out of many more that I could do. Are the so-called Gautreaux assisted housing program and also moving to opportunity. Do most of you people know what these are? So I don't have to talk about these. Some of you know. Okay, I'll be very quick. So the Chicago Housing Authority sometime in the 1960s was sued because people who were residents were saying that they were forced to live. They were intentionally placed in isolated inner city neighborhoods that were bad in all kinds of ways. And in a settlement agreement, the Chicago Housing Authority agreed to create this assisted housing program where, in a somewhat random way, and I'm not going to go into the details, it was not all that random, but it was somewhat random, individuals were given the opportunity, either who lived in these projects, were given the opportunity either to live in, to move to another part of the city or actually go out to the suburbs, and they were given a voucher if they wanted to do this. And then there were a number of people and so some people went out to the suburbs, and then some people stayed in the city, and so scholars have, in particular, James Rosenbaum, right, at Northwestern, and co-workers spent some time trying to follow these people and see how their outcomes differ depending upon whether they went to the suburbs or not. These studies are fraught with difficulty. For example, I think they were not able, as I recall, to track people who move out to the suburbs and then came back to the cities, right? The assignment, of course, itself, I mean, you know, was not entirely random, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean you should throw away the data, right? So let me make that clear. But I'm not going to talk a lot about that because, after all, I'm a theorist, and the last person you want to hear on econometric methodology is me. There's Moving to Opportunity was an experiment that was implemented by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which was exactly to try and determine what the effects of moving low-income families out of high-poverty areas would be. There are countless papers that have used the MTO data, and I'm not going to review them at all, but it's easy for you to track. Probably most of you know many of these papers. How many of you, by the way, I'm just curious, how many of you are budding labor economists in the broad sense? And how many of you are, say, development economists, public economics, right? Anyone want to do theory? Of course not, right? No? Oh, yeah, or maybe? Okay, good. Oh, glad you're here. All right. Okay. You know, most of the people in the room don't know this, but we have a lot to tell these people, right? And I'm going to, and I'm going to, we'll talk about some of that. All right, so, and then going beyond this, right, there have been numerous studies of the effects of school vouchers where programs which have had the consequence of moving children out from one educational environment into another, and so this is another source of data that one can use to talk about peer effects, so on and so forth. So peer effects and things like this have become very, very popular in economics. I guess you know that, or you wouldn't. I mean, if you study inequality, you would have to know this, right? So I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. econometric methodologies for dealing with these, these kinds of data sets have become increasingly sophisticated. I think it's interesting that the first linear social interaction models that I know of that were estimated come from the late 70s, and then there was Linda Datcher in the 1984, something like that. And it wasn't until, I guess, sometime in the 90s that someone actually came around and started thinking about, well, is a social interaction parameter actually identified, right? And we've come really a long way, right, since then. I might talk a little bit about some identification issues in the linear model, and maybe a little bit in nonlinear models as well. So when we think about trying to study social interactions of different kinds, social norms, peer effects, so on and so forth, stigma, couple of questions. One question is, what are appropriate tools for modeling social interactions? How do we actually get at these in some kind of theoretical way? I think, by the way, and maybe this is a good time to say this and just get this out of the way, I think it's very important to approach these in some kind of theoretical way, because if you are, right, say a labor economist, right, and you study, for example, some job training program, there are two kinds of things that you can do. You can become an economic historian, and you can say, I want to know how this program worked, right, and or if it worked, and then you might look for identification strategies that involve various statistical assumptions and so on and so forth. And the econometricians in the room, please feel free to jump on me if you disagree with this. And that's fine, if you want to do that. But and then you could write a book on economic history. But normally we want to ask those questions because we want to, in fact, say something about the world. We say, maybe we want to try this program in some other setting, or maybe we want to change some of the parameters of the program or something like that. The minute that we do something like that, right, we're now asking we're now trying to extend what we see going on in this data set to other situations which are external to our data set, right? And so when you claim that this program worked well here, therefore we should try it over there, you're actually making a bunch of theoretical claims, right? You're claiming that the underlying relationships are somehow stable, right? So that what we saw here, we can expect to see over there, right? Now, if you're going to make theoretical claims like that, you ought to actually display them. You ought to number one, it would be nice if you knew that they were consistent claims. We ought to have some kind of basis for evaluating what those kinds of theoretical claims actually are, whether they make sense, right? So we move away from statistical identification, right? Identification through statistical assumptions to identification through theoretical assumptions, right? When we try and estimate behavioral relationships that we think might have broader degrees of stability. And of course, the farther we want to go, right, the deeper the theory has to be, and the more difficult the whole exercise becomes, and frankly, the more tenuous the whole exercise becomes, right? But this is the path that you're on, right? And so I think that I'm not saying that every paper that you ever, that every paper, and he said this big kind of elaborate structural model with 50 equations all developed, but it is important, I think, to try and make very clear the kind of empirical claims, the kind of theoretical claims that you're making when you say that this is an important because, or from this I can infer that, right? That inference, that's kind of the interesting step for economists, and there's a lot of theory embedded in it. And I guess I'm not happy with contemporary economic discourse today because I see that we're not very careful about that. And it's hard sometimes in reading papers or listening to talks to figure out what it is what kind of belief system of the author underlies the conclusions that they're drawing from the study, right? So, all right. So there are two levels at which we ask questions about the phenomena that I've just put under this heading of social interactions. One has to do with what goes on at the microeconomic level? How exactly is it, right, that you exert an influence on me, right? And it's easy to point to lots of studies where the focus has really been on the microeconomics of what's going on. And then, on the other hand, we want to see as well the aggregate effects of social interaction. So we've talked about things like social multipliers, for instance, right? Do these things have implications at a I said aggregate, but I really should have used the phrase emergent effects, because it turns out that and by emergent I mean something very particular. What I mean is phenomena that occur on if I have a system, say, of interacting agents, I can look at what's happening to the little agents. That's kind of the micro stuff, right? By emergent phenomena, I mean phenomena that we observe that occur on a spatial scale or a time scale or an agent scale or a group scale, which is different than the scales at which the driving equations of the system work. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of that in just a second. But that's what I mean by aggregate effects. These kind of really large systemic effects. And we want to study both of these questions. So let me give you an example. I want to talk for just a minute about the economics of crime. One question that has engaged a number of people is what is the role of social structure in juvenile crime? And so this is actually, I know you all recognize this. This is Philadelphia. Okay. There's the airport, right? Okay, it's the only part of Philadelphia I know. And this picture actually, which it's hard to read, isn't it? Comes from a paper by a fellow named Mark Warr. It's called "The Organization and Instigation in Delinquent Groups." And the question is, what is the role of peer interactions in juvenile crime? And so what Warr and actually a number of other people have studied is recidivism. Okay, they're interested in the question about who's going to commit crimes a second time, a third time, or a fourth time, and what this research uncovered, it's really hard to see this, but what you can what this picture is designed to tell us is that that if you look at the spatial location of criminal activity, okay, that stuff appears, and in particular, if we look at criminal activity by people who are committing multiple crimes, right, who having come through the juvenile justice system once are doing it again, and in particular, this has to do with drug sales. Okay, or drug purchases, that stuff happens in groups, okay, that there's a great deal of clustering in juvenile crime. Now, I suppose that this isn't a surprise to terribly many people in this room, right? You might guess that we've all been teenagers, right? And we know how teenagers interact, and collectively we do crazier things than any one of us might do individually. And maybe you might think that that's more true for teenagers than for adults, where you know, a lot of the social controls are not entirely in place, okay? And that's true, but they found some deeper facts and more interesting facts, and that is that what is the pattern? You know, the deeper pattern of social interaction is, it's not that a bunch of kids hanging out on a street corner suddenly kind of, you know, they talk one another, you know, up, and the next thing they're knowing, they're stealing someone's purse or something like that. What these guys have discovered is, in fact, that there are, in some sense, crime entrepreneurs, crime leaders, that there is a rather small group of individuals, right, who go around and essentially recruit people for their next activity, right? Now, if we think about those two different stories, one is that kids are just kind of working each other up to commit crimes, or another is that there are, in some sense, group leaders, what I'm going to call juvenile criminal entrepreneurs, the way you would deal with these things, if you wanted to kind of, you know, cut back on juvenile crime, the kinds of strategies you would employ for doing that really are very dependent on which story you believe, right? And so looking at the microeconomics of crime, exactly how the social interaction is taking place is critical for 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 actually stopping crime. Okay, so that's an example of where we want to really know something about the microdynamics. Okay, let me give you another example. This one is off the top of my head. I have some pictures later that illustrate it. If you study networks of sexual contact, okay, the canonical story is that there are a rather few individuals who have a large number of partners, and if we then look at the connectivity of the network of relationships, right, can have rather long chains in it, but most of these chains run through a rather small number of very, very active people. Okay. And that suggests then that if you want to engage in policies to, for example, to try and shrink the rate of STD transmission, that what you want to do is you really want to target these very active people in some way. So a group of sociologists, James Moody, Peter at Columbia, pardon? Behrman, right, and I don't remember Stovall, right? John Stovall actually went and looked at sexual relationships in high school. They found a very, very different pattern, right? They found the way that they describe, there's a very, 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 I'll show you the picture in a little while. They found indeed that there was a fair amount of connectivity in the network, but in some sense the network was so diffuse, they said that people wouldn't even be, students weren't aware in some sense that they were part of a chain. Okay, a couple forms and they're together for a while and then they break up and then someone goes somewhere else and so on and so forth. And looking at that, at the trace of that dynamic over 6 months, gives a highly, gives a network which has a very, very large component in it, long chains within it, right? But you can't really identify, central people, right? The way that you can in adult sexual networks, right? So again, therefore the strategies for dealing with STD transmission in that population are going to be very different, and this is what micro-studies tell us. And I'm belaboring this too long. Aggregate analysis. How many of you are familiar with this paper? It's a well-known paper, right? 1996, QJE, Ed Glazer, Jose Schenkman, Bruce Sacerdote. What they're interested in looking in this paper, what they're interested in trying to do is, what they want to try and do in this paper is describe the fact that the variation in crime rates in cities, right, is much larger, right, than one might have otherwise thought. So the emphasis here is not on what causes crime. The emphasis here is on the impact of social interaction on an emergent property of the microprocesses, which is namely the high degree of variation of crime rates in these aggregates called cities. Okay, so what they did was to deploy a social interaction model that worked at the micro level in order that gave the conclusion that when you look across cities there would be a higher variance. Very briefly, I'm going to describe this model very briefly. Now they had a very interesting strategy for writing this paper. They did not write down a theoretical model that they could then kind of map into a statistical model in some rather short way and then estimate it. What they did was to tell a theoretical story with a very, very stripped down kind of theoretical model. And this suggested that they should look for, quote, something, unquote, and then they went and looked for that in the data in very, very different ways. Okay, so and I think it's often the case that theory, the gap between theory and empirical analysis is really quite large, and it was in this case. But on the other hand, I think their idea, in fact, was a very good idea, and it actually has been. Well, let me quickly describe what they did. They imagined, this is kind of the stylized story, they imagined that people live on a line and everybody influences the person to their left. Okay, and this is it's maybe more highly socialized, more under-economized line. Some people are hardened criminals. You know, they're just going to commit crimes. And there are other people who are good guys who are just never going to commit a crime. And then most of the people, right, can be influenced. Right? So if I happen to be next to someone who commits a crime and I'm not one of these types, hard, fast types, then, well, if you commit a crime, I'm going to commit a crime. And then my neighbor's going to commit a crime, right? And we'll have this chain of criminal activity that stops when the person to the left is a good guy, right? And he says, well, I don't care about all you people committing crimes. You're horrible people. God will punish you, right? And I'm going to not commit a crime, all right? And then maybe the influenceable person next to him will say, I'm going to be a good guy too, and that goes until we get to the next hardened criminal, right? So that's the model. That is the story that they told, and then they proceeded to compute some variances, right? So if P1, it would have been nice if I'd actually explained my notation. So let's let AI denote the action of person number I, right? And the action that you're going to take is the action that was taken by the first person to your right who was a pure type. All right? And that person might be you, by the way, yes? Yeah, so there's right, so let me explain that very quickly. There is a probability P0 that you're a good guy. There's a probability P1 that you're a criminal. And with the complement of those two probabilities, you are a completely impressionable person, okay? And so the expected value of any person, be it a person who has a definite type or an influenceable person, is P1 over P0 plus P1. So if we say that AI is going to be 1 if you commit a crime, 0 if you don't commit a crime, okay? P1 is the probability of being a criminal, P0 is the probability of being a good guy, right? Then what we want to do is we want to look at the conditional probability of the nearest person to your right who is not influenceable. We want to look at the conditional probability that that person is a criminal, and that's P1 over P0 plus P1, okay? So you can do all these calculations, and the point of these calculations is the following, that if it was just the case that fraction P of the people in the population were criminals and fraction 1 minus P was not, right? If we normalized the population variance the right way, we would expect the variance of the crime rate in the group, right, would just be, given by, P over 1 minus P, right, multiplied the right way, right? So what they discover is that because of the social interaction effect, if we have one criminal, okay, that guy brings a whole bunch of people along with him, right? And then if we have one good guy, that guy brings a whole bunch of other people along with him. So what that does, and I didn't write down these calculations, I didn't want to talk about them very much. What that does is it has the effect of blowing up the variance over what it would be if everybody were IID. These positive correlations in individual activities, right, create a higher variance for the aggregate, okay? So then what Schenkman and Glaser and Sacerdote did was they actually tried to estimate what this multiplication factor was, okay? Pardon me? Which? No. P0 plus P1 is less than 1. Right? So P0 plus P1 is the probability that you are a hardened type of some kind. Right? So this number is at most 1. Right? And so this is a positive number, and this turns out to be the appropriate scale factor. Oh, I hit the wrong button. And what they do is this f of pi, this is the number we want to pay attention to. This is the, they look at a bunch of different data sets that have crime behavior for cities, and they then scale them by their population size the right way, and then they ask, well, how much larger is the variance than what we would expect to see if it were IID, right? And that is this number f of pi. And these are estimates they came up with for these different data sets, and I could even tell you what these data sets are, I think. There's the 1985 FBI cross-city data set. There's a data set from 1970, same thing. New York City level precinct data, and so on and so forth. Now, so this idea of comparing variances, and so what essentially the idea here is that they're comparing variances. They're saying the variances here that we see in these aggregates are larger than we would expect to see if everybody were an independent actor, right? And that is evidence of social influence, right? It's evidence of this peer effect. And the greater this multiplicative factor is, the smaller the sum P0 plus P1 has to be, the larger the fraction of the population which is in fact influenceable. Influence, you know what I mean, can be influenced by, right, the actors. Yes?
But couldn't it also be due to correlation in other determinants?
Well, they were, of course, what they did was much more, I mean, they actually did something much more clever than what I'm describing, because what they did was they worried, of course, about all these other determinants, and so you have to actually estimate P0 and P1, right? So what they did was they estimated P0 and P1 using a logit model, I think, where they tried to control for all kinds of other things. So it's not, so of course they worried about that, right, as well. And then what they did was they constructed the variance that they would get from the logit probabilities that they estimated, having controlled for everything in sight, right? But the whole point is to get to this f of pi, right? Yes. And by the way, I don't really want to defend this study because there are lots of issues with it. But I want to, and the point that I want to make in bringing it up here is that, so we have these two different approaches, right, to trying to study social interactions. You can actually go down onto the street, right, which is what Mark Warr did, and you know, essentially get street level or incident level data. On the other hand, we can actually look for social interactions through their aggregate effects, which is what these guys are doing here. Now, the difficulty in doing it with the aggregate effects is that you need a model that allows you to infer from the micro level to the aggregate level, right? And of course, the minute you have a model, you can criticize your model all to, you know, wherever, right? But we do have these two very different, very complementary approaches. Yeah, yes, these are not interesting people. That's right. There's no one here you'd want to have at a dinner party, right? These are not fun people. But on the other hand, you know, what is the you know, kind of the point of doing theory in some sense is to be reductionist, right? In order to kind of get down to something, you know, we're all influenceable to different degrees, and peer effects work in very subtle ways, this kind of social influences. We could actually build models like that of individuals and then have a model that would be unanalyzable, right? And so here, and I think it's very interesting here the way that Glaser, Schenkman, and Sacerdote and Schenkman deployed the theoretical model. They applied this very theoretical, stripped down theoretical model to suggest a story that says this is kind of a multiplier effect, okay? And that's all they want to do. And when you think about how this works, it's very plausible that you could build many more complicated models that would talk about degrees of peer influence and stuff like this, right? And then have maybe a less of a multiplier effect, but still have a multiplier effect, right? So their point here was not to have the individual model be descriptive in some way, except at a very, very coarse level, right? Well, remember, this is not a policy tool, right? When you want to do policy, you are going to have to actually be much more sophisticated than this. But their goal in this paper was not to say, all right, how are we going to reduce crime, right? Their goal in this paper was simply to say, we see this enormous variation in these aggregate statistics, and it seems surprising. How might we understand that, or how might we explain that? I want to be very careful with the use of the word explain, because we say we explain all kinds of stuff, and I don't think we explain anything, right? What we do is that we tell stories that are not inconsistent with, okay? And that's, when you hear an economist use the word explanation, that's what it really means, okay? And so they want to tell a story that is not inconsistent with this variance, and the IID story seems to be inconsistent, right? The social interaction story is not. One thing I want to say about social interactions is that, yeah, Jim. Right.
Interpret that. But I'm just thinking at the individual level, that, that was a classic issue, right? Going back almost 100 years, where people were trying to separate contagion models from dependence models, where individuals, so you put balls in polyurine,
Right.
you can actually increase variance in the same way.
No, you can, and now the question is, what kind of social story would go along with that?
Well, just that I committed a crime, now I've lost my reputation, now I'm incarcerated, now, so this individual now is...
Right. So right. Right.
I'm just asking at this level, it's too
Right. Oh, I think that's entirely right, and you know that this is actually why we want to do theory, right? Because so Jim just gave another theoretical story, which is a story of individual level dependence, right? That these probabilities are not stationary, right? That there are criminal activities that drive you, having once engaged, having once been stigmatized, and I'm glad you mentioned this because, I wrote a paper on this. I have a theoretical model of stigma, where you get this magnification effect at the individual level, right? Here they're telling a different story where it's a social effect. So immediately the word that should come to your mind now is identification, right? How do we distinguish one model from the other, right? And of course, Glaser, Sacerdote, and Schenkman did not do that, right? And it's an interesting exercise to come back and think about, could you even distinguish these at the aggregate level? I'm not sure that the answer to that is yes. I think with panel data, yes. With panel data you could, but even there you need, if you think about the individual dependent story, you need at least to be able to identify who is the group of people who, committed a crime last period and now what are they doing, right? So you need to have a greater degree of disaggregation than the entire population, the aggregate crime rate alone, which is what they had, right? And I think the art of doing something like this is to see, how minimal can you make, the data demands. And we could stop right now and begin to write that paper. That would be fun. Now you've got me thinking about this. This is horrible. All right, let me move on. I'm spending way too much time talking about empirical stuff for someone who's not an empirical economist. But I want to tell you that there are, I think, and the econometricians in the room should feel free to pile on more, essentially three big problems in trying to study social interaction empirics. And the first one is unobserved correlated shocks. So let me give an example of this. So Bruce Sacerdote wrote a paper on the freshman year experience at Dartmouth, right? So Dartmouth, fortunately for him, maybe because of him, who knows, right? Assigns freshman roommates at random, right? Does random roommate assignments. And so what he did was he found at the end of the day that roommates' performance was correlated, okay? And not just GPA and stuff like that, but on decisions to join fraternities and sororities and things like this, that there seemed to be roommate social influence. And in particular, and the thing that I think was the highlight of the paper for him, was that according to his estimates, there are peer effects in GPA, and these occur at the individual room level, right? So actually, I'm now I have to read my notes to recall all of this, that there were, if we talk about the activity of, say, joining a fraternity, right? I said sororities, but there aren't sororities at Dartmouth, right? There are? Okay, All right. So, anyways, for some reason I thought there wasn't. Anyways, but he found that the peer effects worked at both the dormitory level and at the room level for joining social groups, whereas for GPA, it didn't seem to be at the dorm level, but it did seem to be at the room level. Right. Now, here's the question: is that GPA effect? Is this really a social interaction effect? So let me tell you two stories. One is the story that Sacerdote wanted to tell, and that is that the fact that one roommate is working hard spurs on the other one to work hard, or if one roommate is off at the bar, he drags the other roommate off with him, right? And that's the social interaction story. The other social interaction story is that these two guys who are rooming together did very badly because their neighbors on either side have the biggest stereo systems in the dorm, and they're on 24 hours a day. Right, they moved off campus. They lived above a bar, right, and so there was this external factor that was operating on both roommates that worked at the roommate level, right. So that's an example, right, of an unobserved correlated shocks. And of course, there are ways of handling this, right? So, but Bruce didn't do those, and so one has to wonder, right? I think it's not the firmest paper that has ever appeared in the QJE, but it's certainly a very provocative. Is that? It's kind of like it's not damning with faint praise, but faint praise is somehow in there. All right, so. That's true. The next thing I want to talk about is endogeneity of the network. And I'm actually not going to talk about endogenous network formation. Steven, you're going to talk a little bit about endogenous group formation, are you not? Right, okay. And there is there's an interesting study that was done in the 1970s, actually a series of interesting studies by a woman named Denise Kandel. This is, the back of my slides have an extended reading list, and so you'll be able to find all of these things. And what she did was to look at adolescent friendships in a high school, and she looked at, she wanted to assess the degree to which people, were alike, right? Were they alike in their behaviors? Were they alike in their characteristics? There's a name for this word. It's called homophily, right? I think we owe the word to Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton, who used it in the 1950s. And over break, if you ask me, I'll tell you the story of how they began their collaboration by walking out of a dinner party. She studied this, and she wanted to ask the following question. She said, do people act together? Do people tend to act the same way because they're friends, or are they friends because they act the same way? Okay, and this is a very important question and hard to answer. And so she looked at, what did she do? What did she look at here? So she looked at marijuana use. She looked at involvement in minor delinquent activities. So those are, she also did some survey stuff on educational aspirations, and she also asked people about their political orientations. And remember, this is she did this, I guess she did this research in the mid-late 1970s. Now, these two different phenomena, the way in which the causal arrow goes here has, in fact, a big impact on aggregate social behavior. So, for instance, if we think that networks evolve around behaviors, right, what's the consequence of that? The consequence is that people exhibiting particular kinds of behaviors are going to become socially isolated, or that we will all become socially isolated into rather homogeneous behavioral groups, right? So, that's kind of, so that social isolation is a consequence of having networks forming around behaviors. On the other hand, to the extent that behaviors form around networks, right, when like people begin to behave similarly to other like people, maybe because of these peer effects or knowledge effects, right? I talk a lot about peer effects that there are, but remember I gave a list of many different kinds of social interactions that could go on. That has different implications. So for example, many poverty trap stories, right? Again, poverty traps were something that you saw a lot in the development literature of about 10 years ago, right? And poverty trap stories emerged this way, right? So that you have loci of low resource people who then who don't have resources to redistribute amongst each other, and because they're locked into this bad place in the network, they can't get out. An example of this, if you want to think about an extended family or a family line, a family tree as a network, and there's no reason why you shouldn't. Of course, this is Glenn Lowry's story, right, which we heard about from, I think it was from Steven, and on Monday, that families that families that don't have capital in a world where their capital markets are imperfect can then not borrow, right, and therefore are fated not to make the investments in human capital that would allow them to get out. And so this goes on and on and on. And I think, by the way, that that is, as it leaves out a lot of interesting stuff, but it's a very clever deployment of dynamic programming. I would encourage people to read that paper. So in any event, I'm not going to talk very much about endogenous network formation, and instead I want to talk more about, well, here's the things I do want to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit, so I began by talking about social influence generally, and you'll notice that I've kind of shifted to networks, right? So there's a question about how do we want to model social influence, right? And it seems that if we are in fact going to talk about and try and build micro-based models of how people influence each other, we need to have some kind of way of describing who it is that's interacting with whom, right? And so a natural tool for doing this, one that first sociologists glommed onto and then later on economists, has been to actually study networks, right? Now formally, we're going to talk a little bit about network science in just a moment. How are we going to represent a social network, the kinds of networks that we are all embedded in? The way that we're going to describe it formally is through a mathematical device called a graph. And by a graph, I don't mean the graph of a function, right? I mean something that I'll describe formally in just a second. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some applications of social networks to labor markets. I'm going to talk about games on networks. I'm going to talk a bit about the social capital literature. I'm going to talk about the emergence of social norms and social learning diffusion of behaviors on network. I won't have time actually to probably I won't probably get more than 2/3 of the way down this list. The community structure section of my slides is not even finished because as I got more entangled in this problem, I realized that I wasn't sure what the question was in trying to describe community structure and talk about things like the degree of segregation in a social network. So I hope to complete those notes sometime. But don't worry, we won't get there. So here's what I want to alert you to, and that is the fact that a lot of people are out there estimating social influence or social interaction models. A lot of people are theorizing about them, but nonetheless, the theory has really delivered very little. Okay, you might regard that as bad news. I regard that as good news for you, because what that means is that there's just tremendous opportunities to do stuff. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to begin with labor markets, because I'm going to talk about a network phenomenon, something that's been written about by sociologists and economists, and see how it might actually have an influence in markets. But what we're going to see is that the kind of models that are deployed to talk about these things in markets are not exactly network models. And the reason for that is that the models get very complicated very quickly. And we will see that in talking about labor markets. And then what we're going to do is what I'm then going to do is move to a whole set of topics that I think of as being tools that you might deploy to build network-based models of the kind of phenomena that you want to study. So, for instance, it seems to me that if you want to study something like the diffusion of technology, right? network-based statistical models are going to be a very useful thing to do, right? It's very clear. I mention this because I have in my life spent some time walking around in African villages talking to farmers about where they learn stuff, right? And they do say things like, that guy over there, he doesn't know anything, right? And this other guy over here, you know, and there is a very clear social network. In fact, another thing I learned by spending some time in Western Kenya is that if you are a Luo, you do not get agricultural advice from a Lua, even if you happen to live in the same village. Okay, this kind of social structure seems to matter a great deal, right? And we would want to take advantage of it. So there are ways I think there are ways of deploying the kind of tools I'm going to be talking about to build interesting empirical models. But since the surface has barely been scratched, I think this is tremendous opportunity for your cohort, okay? So don't waste it. All right. So let's first talk about network assignment, network science. So what do I mean by a graph? A graph is, here's what I mean by a graph. We're going to have a set of vertices, a set of things called points, okay? And then we're going to have a set of edges that connect them. Okay, so where you've seen a graph of this kind before is no doubt in your microtheory class you drew a game tree, right? A game tree is a graph. It's a directed graph. It's got an initial thing called the root of the game tree, and then you've got these lines coming down, right, that indicate the moves. Those are edges, and those are directed, right, in the sense that, you know, if here's a node in the game tree here and a line coming down like that and another node down here, what it means is that if this guy takes this move, right, now this guy down here gets to work, okay? So the direction of the edges in the game tree measure, you could say they measure the flow of time, or they measure the flow of activity through the tree, right? We describe these edges simply by saying that they're an ordered pair that go from from node V to node W, so we just write the ordered pair VW. A lot of research has been done, a lot of applications of graph theory to economics have been done with undirected graphs, which is to say that if there's an edge going this way, then there's a complementary edge going back the other way, and so we don't have to distinguish the direction, okay? And those are called undirected graphs. Some language, it's good to have some language. The degree of a node is the, I'm only going to talk today about undirected graphs, largely because I don't want to stumble over the terminology, okay? The degree of a node in an undirected graph is simply the number of edges that come out of that node, right? And by the way, for directed graphs, you talk about in degree and out degree, and you can imagine what that might be about. That's why we're not going there. A path is an ordered list of nodes, right? Such that each pair is connected by, each pair in succession is connected by an edge. So that you can imagine starting at node V0, traversing to node V1, traversing to node V2, and so on down to the end. And that's called a path. That's obvious, right? One of the things that we want to do is measure social distance. How far are you from me? Okay, so what we do is we look at all the different paths in a network to connect you to me, and we ask how many steps, how many edges in the shortest such path. That shortest such path is called the geodesic. Okay, think great circles. It's the, you know, if you fly, right, it's the same thing. Shortest distance, it's the shortest length path connecting two nodes, right? And this is the kind of thing that graph theorists or people who do empirical work on graphs talk about all the time. A subset of vertices is connected if there's a path between any pair in the subset. A component is a set of vertices that is connected, and second is maximal with respect to this property, which is to say there's no one who's connected to anybody in this set who is not already listed in our set. Is this, a component will contain a list of vertices that are connected to each other, and there will be no other vertices connected to anyone in that set that are not in our component. Okay, that's, do you see? Is it clear? I'm not saying this. I'm not saying this very well. Draw a little picture. Pardon? I could use the wall. This is all I need. Okay, right. I'm very minimal. Okay, here's a graph. This graph has one component. This graph has two components, all right? This set here is not a component because it's a connected set of vertices, right? But there's this guy, right, who's connected to this guy, and he's not in the set, right? All right, so if we've got a component, there is a path from anybody in the component. There's a path from anybody in the component to everybody else in the component, and there are no paths going out. Okay, is that clear now? Okay, so that's a component. And then the last, I guess the last term that I will use a lot is a component. Suppose that everybody is directly connected to everybody else, right? They're all one big happy embrace, big happy family, right? That's a clique. So a clique is a component where everybody, where the maximal path length between any two people is 1, where everybody's so completely connected, okay? Graphs have matrix representations, 2 words that you'll hear depending upon the discipline which the user comes from. Mathematicians and graph theorists will talk about, computer scientists will talk about something called an adjacency matrix. Sociologists will talk about a sociomatrix. Okay, and what is a adjacency matrix or a sociomatrix? It's a square matrix that has a row and a column corresponding to each person in the graph. Okay, and there is a 1 in the VW entry, in the VW position in the matrix, if there is an edge from V to W. Okay, all right. So if we have a undirected graph where, remember, the directions go both ways, right? If there's an edge from V to W, there's an edge from W to V, so those are going to be symmetric. Okay, there are a number of other matrices that you will hear that are deployed to talk about graphs, and I'm not going to talk about any of those. People will talk about something called the Laplacian of a graph. There are several other things, but the adjacency matrix is the thing that people will use without defining, right? So that's why you should know. The others you can, people will tell you what it is. Yes?
So how important is the strength of these graphs?
Well, that's the next thing I want to talk about, okay? So right now, essentially, as far as I've gone, all I'm doing is kind of recording the topological structure, that you and I are connected and Steven and I are connected, right? But I've known you for 10 minutes and I've known Steven for 15 years, right? So it's a much stronger connection. The way that we might represent that is by using something called a weighted adjacency matrix, where instead of having a 1 to indicate a link between 2 given people, right? We will use a number where the magnitude of that number represents a strength, okay? And furthermore, we could even go farther and say that these numbers don't have to be positive numbers. I could be a negative influence on you, right? So we could have then like a negative number for that, right? And on the other hand, Jim could be a positive influence on me, and so he'd be a positive number. So we can go to higher and higher degrees of versatility, okay? So and yes, so right. So we can do all of those things, right? And I might have said this when you stepped out, but today I largely want to talk about undirected graphs, just because the language of talking about directed graphs it gets complicated, right? Connected versus strongly connected, in degree, out degree, and all that. So I'm gonna I will be clear on what I'm talking about, but this is a rather flexible way of describing social relationships. But there's one way in which it's really limited, and I think this is worth thinking about. I could, suppose that there was some natural process by which people formed a social network in some village that the economists, might want to go in and study. And suppose it essentially appears as if people have these long-standing friendships, but they were essentially randomly formed at the beginning, when people first came to the village or something like that. And that's one way of forming a network, right? And so now I come in, the economist or the sociologist, and I ask, who are your friends? And I trace out this network, and I might look at the network I have and then say, gee, this looks a lot like what's called an Erdős-Renyi random graph or a Bernoulli network. These are the same thing. And I'll be defining them later on. What are they? It looks as if essentially that you flip a coin, and if it comes up heads, there's a link between us. If it comes up tails or not, right? So here we have this permanent network, this long-standing network, right, which is durable, has gone on for years, but it has the properties of a Bernoulli random graph. There are certain properties that Bernoulli random graphs have, and this network seems to have these properties, so you might say it's an instance of, it's a realization of such a graph. Now here's another story, right? People just talk to each other at random. Every now and then they bump into each other and say, how are the crops doing? What seed are you using? Are you what kind of technique are you using? So on and so forth. And then the survey researcher comes in and says, who did you talk with in the last 6 months? Which is the typical survey question, right? That has often been used for these. What do you get, right? And then they say, well, gee, I talked to you, right? So the survey guy writes it down. And then it turns out that, Durlauf and Heckman talked to each other, so he writes that down, right? What does he get at the end of that? He gets a Bernoulli random graph, right? But notice that the underlying mechanisms are very different, right? The graph that I described first, this network of friendships and relationships, is very, very stable. This other network, right, has no stability, no durability at all, right? And so we represent them the same way, but it would be very misleading to think that social process is described by one when in fact it's described by the other, right? So in the first case, there really is a graph. There are people who permanently do not talk to each other. In the other one, right, everybody has the potential for talking to everybody else, but you've got things to do in life other than talk all day, and so you don't talk to everybody during the sampling period, right? We end up with the same kind of mathematical object. And that suggests, so there is a paper, and I now don't even remember the entire reference. It is by Duncan Watts and Georgi, what's his last name? He was actually a postdoc on a grant that I had. I can't remember his last name. But he's written with Strogatz, right? Duncan Watts was Strogatz's, thesis student? Right, I think. Anyways, it appeared in Science. It's about the Columbia email network. Okay, so what they did was they got suitably anonymized information about who sent emails to whom over the course of either a semester or an academic year. I don't remember, it's one of the two, right? And then they traced out the network. And one of the things they were interested in was how durable were the relationships, right? And a lot of relationships were very durable, a lot were not. It's basically pretty clear that if you wanted to talk about the social structure, right, of Columbia, electronic communications, right, that you were really dramatically under-theorizing the thing if you were going to rely on a network representation alone, right? So we should, in fact, realize that the networks that we go out and measure are just traces, right, of some other kind of more complicated social process, right? And we should be alert to that because it's actually not, well, it's fun. I don't want to say it's easy, but it's fun to go out and try and construct better, maybe stochastic representations of some of these underlying processes. And there certainly has been work that does that. So we get locked into thinking about, well, there's a network there. But in fact, oftentimes there's really not a network, or what we're seeing is not all of the network. Common network measurements. We talk a lot about the diameter of a graph. Remember that I'll take your question in 1 second. Remember that we can talk about the shortest distance, we can talk about the distance between two people as the shortest length, the length of the shortest path between them. Once we've got the length of two people, we can ask, what is the farthest distance between two people, right? That's the diameter of a graph. We can also talk about the average distance between two people, an object that lots of people theorize about that seems to be very important for a number of different network properties having to do with diffusion, learning on networks, is the degree distribution, right? What fraction of the population is of degree 3, of degree 5, of degree 7, so on and so forth. And you probably heard discussions of things like long-tail distributions for this. Clustering coefficient. This has a lot to do with who talks to whom. All right, I'm going to stop and take your question, and then I'm going to come back and talk about this. Okay.
So my question was just about, you're talking about these two different
Right.
ways of finding the network. And I'm just thinking, it really depends on the question that you're interested in answering, right?
Oh, sure.
If you're looking at social learning, say, then who talked to whom during the past 6 months is maybe really the relevant thing if you want to look at diffusion of the technology. And even though some people are friends, but if they don't really talk, then that would not be a challenge.
Well, right. I think what I would want to do, though, is something different in that case, right? So it could be that I believe that in every village out there, there is this hardwired social network. And therefore, what I need to do is to find the key people and set them up to be demonstration guys. Okay, and so having done some kind of study, then that tells me that this network phenomenon is important, right? Then I should really go in and spend a lot of resources in finding the key people, right? On the other hand, right, it could well be that everybody talks to everybody with more or less the same frequency, in which case there really aren't key people. So if I go in and try and find the key people, I'm just wasting a lot of money, right? So again, it's this problem. If you want to study what's going on in one village, that's fine, right? If you then want to infer from that about what to do in other villages in order to get this new crop out there or something like that, then you really have to have a deeper understanding of the process. Because even though obviously the network won't be the same from village to village, if they really are all characterized by durable networks, right, that's going to make a difference for how you deploy, right? And this is why, for example, in Kenya, where I've spent some time, one of the things that that KARI, the Kenyan Agricultural Research Institution, does is they go and they try and find people who, if they have success with the crop, will influence a lot of other people, and then they set them up and they give them every single thing you could imagine, right? In order to kind of make that work out, right? But on the other hand, if it's just people talking to people, right, that's not going to work, right? So I claim that even for again, if you want to do anything other than economic history, right, the distinction that I'm making matters. Okay? Yes. Wait, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I'm a little, I'm an old guy.
I'm just wondering how to solve the self-reported problem. Say, someone, I just want to report like someone I talked to, but not report someone actually who I talked to, but I don't want to report them.
Oh, all right. Well, I think that there is a great deal of, it's always difficult when doing survey research to design a survey that gets number one, gets answers to the question that you want, and number two, is constructed in such a way that people are likely to give you honest answers, right? That is a whole separate course, right? So again, asking a theoretician this is like asking a fish how to ride a bicycle. But having said that, I'll tell you the one thing that I've learned from hanging out with people who do this is that which is obvious in retrospect, but maybe I wouldn't have thought of at the outset, is that it's important to get the right people to ask the questions. Okay, and so if I go and ask people, in some village, who knows, right? But if people that they know and trust, so you spend a lot of time getting the right enumerators, training them the right way, and so on and so forth. And yeah, all data is messy. I don't have much more to say about that except to say that I think that's something you need to be aware of. I think it's a very good question.
Problem here because, like the Colombia story that you said, or in other stories where you can get data from Google or Microsoft, that's not self-reported data, that's real data.
That's what the NSA does, right? Yes. Yeah. No, that's right. That's right. So there's a lot of research that does not use self-reported data, I mean that stuff is not problematic. It's not without its problems either. But in particular, I think the one thing that's true about social network research these days, and it has been, I think what we really have is we We have some empirical work on lots of social networks. We have enormous amounts of empirical work on the internet, right? And people will say social networks look like X, right? And then when you ask them, why do you think they look like, they'll give you a whole list, right, of social networks where X has been, where this phenomena has been measured, and it turns out that X is the answer. And one of them is Facebook, one of them is Twitter, right? One of them is LiveSpace, right? But there's nothing having to do with, say, what's going on in a classroom, right, or something like that. So there's a great tendency in the empirical work in this area to look at the things that we can measure easily and say, wow, this is, the properties here are generic, where it may, of course, turn out to be the case that those properties are deeply connected with why we can measure them easily, okay? All right, so that's another caveat in doing, this kind of research. One more question, yes?
Very quickly, all this stuff has been kind of presented in terms of the dichotomous, there's a connection, there's not a connection, not how strong the connection.
Right, and so I have talked about the weighted adjacency matrix where we actually do measure strength, right? But let me push that a little farther and say we also should remember that there are lots of activities that we engage in, right? And the network of people that I might use to borrow money from, like Durlauf if I'm not going to pay it back, right, is different, right, from the network of people that I might use if I need to have someone babysit my kids for a while, right? So we have these overlapping social networks that perform different tasks for us, right? And oftentimes we think about, well, if I use someone for one task, I can't use them for another. So these networks interact in complicated ways. And I can think of virtually no papers, at least no papers that I've read that I found at all interesting, that deal with the very interesting question of the allocation of network resources. You have a bunch of network resources open to you, available to you, but you use them at cost, right? And so you have to, if I'm going to bug this guy because I need a job, right, can I bug him then in 6 months for something else, right? And those kinds of things are very important. Right, and so the weights, what I'm saying is that the weights are in fact endogenous to the actions that you undertake. Okay, so I want to go even farther than just saying I haven't measured weights, right? All right, is that?
Yeah, I was going to ask.
I kind of hijacked your question, right?
I was going to ask a very simple question, which is, are these well defined if you have these different weights? Yes.
In what sense, well defined? I can say Aij is a weight, right? But
if you assign weights, you can define all of these things without just saying, all that I've seen is just like this is a one, your degree is the number of people.
right. All right. So how would I talk? All right. So one question, of course, is all right. Let me. You said something at the end. I think the one way to interpret your question is how would I actually measure these AIJs, right, or AVWs, right? Pardon? Well, that would be one way, right? And I'll talk later on after the break about a model where if you had panel data, you actually could measure this thing. And then there's so I think that they are things that we have access to, because remember that these are going to leave their traces in the activity that we do measure, even if we don't see them directly. Maybe we can back them out, okay, in some statistical way. My phone doesn't make that sound, and that's why it's really chilling that sound is coming out of my, all right, pocket. I've got this thing. I hope it's not that. All right, let me talk about very briefly a feature of social networks. May or may not be true. People look for this. It's alleged that that the friends of my friends tend to be my friends too, right? So what does that mean? It means that the relationship of being my friend is a transitive relationship, right? And so this property is called transitivity. How would that appear in a network? It would appear that if there was a path from me to you and there's a path from you to her, then there should be a path from you to me, right? In other words, that there should be triangles, right? That length two paths should tend to be closed into triangles, right? That's what it means. That's how transitivity would reflect itself. So a way of measuring to what degree is that true is to measure something called the clustering coefficient, which is the fraction of the length two paths that actually are in fact closed off into a triangle, right? So here we have a length 2 path. We might ask, is there, is this edge there too, right? And if that edge is there is 2, we say, aha, this is a triangle, okay? And we want to measure the fraction of length 2 paths that occur in triangles. Another thing we want to talk about is the component size distribution. Do we have lots and lots of little islands that don't intersect with each other, or do we have a big gigantic island that intersects with each other? So here, I want to briefly display some social networks. So I mentioned earlier, right, the graph of sexual contacts in a high school. This is that network, right? And you'll notice that there is a giant connected component, right? I think this means that my phone is running out of batteries, so this will stop. And so one thing to notice about this is that you'll notice that with a very few exceptions, like this person here, right, there are not a lot of people who have lots and lots of partners. On the other hand, we have a giant connected component, right? We have a graph, something, as I recall the number, something like close to 50% of the population is in this, of those that reported having relationships at all, are in this component. We have 12 that look like this, 9 that look like that. All right. And the point of this paper, and the reason why it was published in such a good journal, was that this is not what typically adult sexual contact networks look like. Here is this is a picture, another James Moody High School study. I better actually look at my notes to remember what's going on here. In theorizing about social networks, if you read the papers that I've written, or you've read the papers that Matt Jackson or other people write, what you see is that we tend to worry a lot about the topology of the network. We don't tend to worry a lot about the node information, right? So we tend to, theorists in general tend to treat agents as being more homogeneous than in fact they are. What's interesting about this is that this has been plotted in such a way, colors represent ethnicities, okay? And where you are vertically in this graph represents your age, okay? And and now you can't really, you can only see the gross details in this picture. And remember, this was published as a much smaller picture in a journal. But what it's meant to illustrate is that you don't have a lot of stuff, a lot of lines zinging from over here all the way over here, or from here all the way down there, right? So even at this rather gross level of description, you see that there's a lot of stratification by characteristic in the social network, right? And this is true of lots of social networks. And I'm now going to move rather quickly. Here this comes from an article by Mark Newman, which I think is on the reading list. He went out and looked at a lot of things, social networks or networks that come out of social process, okay? There's a lot of things that are lumped together under the rubric social networks that are really quite different, right? So that the network of my friends is different from the network of citations that you find in my papers and other papers, right? And saying that a citation network and a friendship network are the same thing is really stretching it, right? But that happens. All right, so what do we want to know about this? So these are film actors. This is done from the IMDb database, right? Internet Movie Database, right? Company directors, I don't remember. You can go and find the article and see who did all this stuff. What's striking about some of these, and what distinguishes social networks, at least these social networks, and many, many others that have been looked at from random networks, is you see on the one hand, wow, in these networks there's lots and lots of nodes. And yet it turns out that the distance, right, in those that are reported, the distance between the mean distance between two nodes. We draw two nodes, two individuals at random in these networks, and ask how far apart are they, right? And the answer is not terribly far apart, okay? L is what I should be looking at. We also see that, and I kind of like this fact, that there's a great degree of variation in the clustering, right? There are different ways of measuring these clustering coefficients. And the other thing I think that's kind of surprising, you know, you look at this network right here, the math co-authorship network. You know, 250,000 nodes. You know, twice as many edges. Mean degree of only 4, right? And yet, right, path lengths are only 7 on average, right? So that suggests, I mean, if you were just to take those figures and kind of draw a graph at random, it seems that your path lengths might be longer on average, right? This is a kind of and the reason why I put this chart up here, this kind of a striking feature of social networks is it seems that people seem to be reachable from other people, right? So this is related to, but not necessarily a part of the 6th degree of separation story. Yes? Well, there are some sociologists who have looked at that, and what they do is they take panels with 2 or 3 or 4 waves, right? And then they estimate a very, very complicated stochastic structure with that, right? So I'm not sure. I don't find this the most. I'm really opinionated, especially given that all this is going to be videotaped, right? I hope it's behind a password, right? I think that's a really, really good question, right? And this is what Georgi Kosinets, that's who it is, Georgi Kosinets and Duncan Watts. That's what they were trying to do, right? To get us to think about that kind of thing, because it's clear that the dynamics are very complicated. But for the social phenomena of the kind that we're interested in, it hasn't really been done very often, and you can imagine why. I mean, typically, say, you'll find 2 or 3 waves at most in a panel. The homophily study I referred to earlier, Denise Kandel went into a high school once and then went in 6 months later, and that was it. But even using that, she was able to tease out some facts about which friendships were durable, which were not, and how those were correlated with these behavioral characteristics. And also, by the way, how the behavioral characteristics varied even over those 2. So there has been a little bit, but not huge amounts. And if you've got the grant money, I've got some ideas, all right? I'm sure you do too. You don't need my ideas. All right. Just to... anytime you read anything about social networks or any graph theoretic stuff, people always refer to the so-called Erdos-Renyi random graph, right? And 2 Hungarians, you can imagine it's going to be kind of cool. And so what is this? This is we have a collection of edges or collection of vertices, and we pick up each pair of vertices and we flip a coin, and if it's heads, we draw with probability p independently. We put an edge between them with complementary probability we don't, and then we ask at the end of the day what we've got, okay? And the typical thing we do is we ask, I could show you a picture, right? And you can look at one realization of such a picture, right? And not learn very much. So 2 questions to ask. Number 1, what are the average properties, right? What does the distribution of such graphs look like? Now, it's really hard to study the distribution of graphs because they're very complicated things. So we can ask questions like, what does the degree distribution look like, right? Or what does the, the mean path length, right? Or the correlation and degree of connected individuals, what do those things look like? And so typically through clusters of statistics, that's how these things are studied. The other thing that one does is and this may not actually be so interesting for us, but frequently what people do is they'll build a mathematical model and say, now we'll let the number of elements in the graph get, the number of nodes get very large, and we want to ask what are the limit properties as the population size goes to infinity, okay? And the Erdos-Renyi random graph, let me just say one thing about it because you'll hear this a lot. We're going to imagine that we're going to let n get very large. We're going to connect everybody up to everybody else with probability p. We're going to drive n large and p down to 0 in such a way that the mean degree stays constant as we do that, right? So it's like taking a Poisson limit, right? Okay, and when we do that, and so the question is, what's true with large n? Okay, and And what's true is I think some remarkable phenomena that you will, and I'm telling you this very quickly only because you will hear this referred to if you start reading, the sociologists and economists will kind of talk about the giant component, and it's good to know what it is. So I'm now telling you what the giant component is. When the mean degree is less than 1, as we let n get very large, we're going to have lots and lots of little islands. Right? The islands are going to have an exponential size distribution. There are going to be lots of little components, all very, very small. So the world will be an archipelago. Okay? When the mean degree is greater than 1, what happens is that we're going to have a bunch of small islands, and we're going to have one continent. And that continent is going to get, and the size of the islands, essentially, so let me go back to the case where z is less than 1, where the mean degree is less than 1. As we add more and more and more individuals, the size of the islands, the mean sizes of the islands stay fixed. It's just that we add more and more and more islands. Okay? When the mean degree is greater than 1, what happens is we have one, and I'm not kidding, one component that grows linearly with the number of edges. Okay? And then we have a bunch of these small islands. Okay? And for those islands that are not this, and so that thing that grows linearly is called the giant component. Okay? And for the islands that are not the giant component, right, again, their size remains, on average, their average size remains fixed. It's just that you add more and more of them, but the giant component keeps on growing. And the higher above, now another question to ask is, well, what fraction of the population is in the giant component? And you might imagine that right around 1, mean degree 1, it's a very, very small fraction, and it gets larger, right, as the mean degree gets higher, okay? And so that's kind of the key characteristic of these Bernoulli random graphs. Clustering gets small as the graph gets large. And you can read a lot more about these in some of the references. There's a nice discussion of this in both the Easley-Kiefer book, Easley-Kleinberg book, which is on the reading list, and also in Matt Jackson's book. And so this is some of the kind of the lore. All right, so let me. All right, I now want to start talking about economics. So maybe this is a good time to take a break, because I've now held you 15 minutes over. So can we reassemble in 15 minutes? Okay, 15 minutes sharp.